Good morning, everyone. So I'm to present the critical appraisal of the journal article Advocate today. It analyzes the use of avacopan for the treatment of ANCA-associated vasculitis.
Hello, can someone remove this message? Yeah, it's still there.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, we can hear you, but
we can hear you very well. So what is the
right,
problem?
okay.
Can
Okay.
continue.
Okay. So this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine on 18th February 2021. A brief note about ANCA-associated vasculitis. It's a necrotizing vasculitis predominantly affecting the small vessels and the medium vessels, and is associated with the ANCA-specific antibodies, that is myeloperoxidase and proteinase 3 antibody. There are 4 major clinical pathologic variants, including microscopic polyangiitis, granulomatosis with polyangiitis, formerly known as Wegener's granulomatosis, eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis, formerly known as Churg-Strauss syndrome, and organ-limited ANCA-associated vasculitis, mainly the renal-limited form. This is the 2012 revised International Chapel Hill Consensus Conference criteria for vasculitis, which shows the ANCA-associated vasculitis involving the small vessels and the medium vessels. This is a brief summary of the 2017 EULA ERA-EDTA recommendations for the management of ANCA-associated vasculitis. So when there's a new diagnosis of ANCA-associated vasculitis, we have to categorize whether it's a non-organ threatening disease or organ or life-threatening disease. If it is a non-organ threatening disease, we can move on with immunosuppression in oral glucocorticoid lower doses together with methotrexate or mycophenolate mofetil. Whereas in the organ or life-threatening disease, we have to treat them with IV methylprednisolone and high-dose oral prednisolone following that, together with cyclophosphamide or rituximab. In cases where there are rapidly progressive renal failure or pulmonary hemorrhages, there is considerable involvement of the plasma exchange as well. So even if it is treated, ANCA-associated vasculitis can lead to renal impairment, significant organ damage, and also there is a component of medication-related toxic effects, together with a reduction in quality of life. A little bit about the pathogenesis of ANCA-associated vasculitis is important in order to understand where avacopan plays a role in the management. So PR3 and MPU are located in the cytosol, so they are relatively inaccessible to the antibody binding. But once the neutrophils are primed with the tumor necrosis factor, or if they are undergoing apoptosis, or in certain people who have genetic predisposition, they have increased membrane-associated ANCA. So these ANCA can bind to relevant membrane-bound antigens, and therefore this antigen-antibody complex can interact with the endothelium, and that can result in the increased endothelial neutrophil cell interaction, resulting in the ANCA-associated systemic vasculitis. So there's a role of alternative complement pathway, where there is increased formation of the activated complement factor 5, which causes neutrophil chemotaxis and activation of the neutrophils. So this is the step that is blocked by the avacopan. Avacopan is an orally administered small molecule, which is a receptor antagonist for the complement factor 5, the activated form. So activated complement factor 5 receptor is blocked by avacopan. Therefore, the neutrophil chemoattraction and activation, which is formed by the alternative complement pathway, is blocked by avacopan, resulting in a reduction in the neutrophil activation. So with that, I would like to move on to the critical appraisal of the journal article Advocate. This is the criteria that I am using, the CASP checklist, which has about 11 questions that are to be answered to critically appraise the article. There are three main stems. First one is, are the results of the trial valid? And what are the results? And will the trial results help locally? So moving to the first stem, are the results of the trial valid? There are several questions to be answered. The first one is, did the trial address a clearly focused issue? So even with the current therapy, granulomatosis with polyangiitis and microscopic polyangiitis patients have a 2.7-fold increased risk of death compared to the general population. And also, the major causes of death include the complications of immunosuppressive treatment, such as infection, also underlying disease complications such as end-stage kidney disease. In about 10 to 26% patients go into end-stage renal failure. And the other major cause is the cardiovascular disease. So here for the management, glucocorticoids play a major role in remission induction and maintenance. The EULAR recommendation is to achieve a minimum possible dose of 7.5 to 10 milligrams of prednisolone within 3 months of treatment. But practically, that takes about 20 weeks. The graph shows the main pivotal trials in ANCA-associated vasculitis management. And almost in all that, achievement of a dose of glucocorticoids less than 10 milligrams per day has taken about 20 weeks. So this long-term use of high-dose steroids are invariably associated with significant side effects, including infections, drug-induced diabetes, and osteoporosis. Therefore, investigating a therapy that has the potential to be effective in ANCA-associated vasculitis with sparing or elimination of glucocorticoids would be very important. So Avacopan in the trial this is a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 trial, which took for about 52 weeks, followed by an 8-week follow-up period. So patients were given either oral Avacopan with a matching placebo to seem like prednisolone, or oral prednisolone with a matching placebo like Avacopan. And all the patients were given cyclophosphamide with azathioprine or rituximab. So these are the main objectives of Avacopan trial. The primary objective is to evaluate the efficacy of Avacopan to induce and sustain remission in patients with active ANCA-associated vasculitis when used in combination with cyclophosphamide followed by azathioprine or in combination with rituximab. So disease remission was defined as achievement of Birmingham Vasculitis Activity Score of 0 while not taking glucocorticoids within the 4 weeks prior to the 26th week. And sustained remission was defined as maintenance of the remission until week 52, whereas there was no glucocorticoid usage within the 4 weeks prior to the week 52. There were multiple secondary objectives. The main of them include evaluation of glucocorticoid-induced toxicity and to evaluate the safety of Avacopan, and also to evaluate multiple parameters such as health-related quality of life and the changes in the parameters of renal disease and cumulative organ damage. So that answers our first question, whether the trial addressed a clearly focused issue. The next questions can be answered together by describing the methodology of the trial. So moving on to the methodology, this is a phase 3 randomized double-blind, double-dummy, active-controlled, multi-center trial, which was conducted from 15th March 2017 until 1st of November 2019. And 331 subjects with ANCA-associated vasculitis who fulfilled the criteria were enrolled into the study. And the treatment period was 52 weeks, followed by an 8-week follow-up. The main inclusion criteria included a clinical diagnosis of granulomatosis with polyangiitis or microscopic polyangiitis, and an age of at least 18 years. And the patients has to be positive either for anti-PR3 or anti-MPO antibodies, and at least 1 major item or 3 minor items or 2 renal items of proteinuria or hematuria in the Birmingham Vasculitis Activity Score. And they should have eGFR more than 50 and ability to give consent and also to be judged by the investigators to be otherwise fit for the study. The main exclusion criteria include the pregnancy and breastfeeding population, and also alveolar hemorrhages which required invasive pulmonary ventilation, and any other known multisystem autoimmune disorders such as Churg-Strauss, SLE, and so on. And the patients who have received cyclophosphamide within the last 12 weeks prior to the screening were excluded, as that would confound the study. And also the patients who have received intravenous glucocorticoids more than 3 grams of methylprednisolone within the 4 weeks prior to the screening were also excluded. And as well, the patients who were receiving oral prednisolone at a dose of more than 10 milligrams per day for the previous consecutive 6 weeks prior to the screening visit were also excluded. So the next question is whether the patients who were assigned for the treatment were randomized. The randomization was performed by a interactive response technology system, and it was centrally performed with minimization algorithm. And subjects were randomized 1-to-1 into either to the treatment group or to the control comparator group. And they were stratified according to their vasculitis disease status, ANCA status, and immunosuppressive treatment that they are about to receive. So this is the trial design. The test group consisted of 165 individuals, and they received Avocopan 30 milligrams twice daily up till 52 weeks. And they received a dummy prednisolone tapering over 21 weeks. And all of them received either rituximab of 4 weeks or cyclophosphamide for 12 weeks followed by azathioprine. And in the active comparator group, they received placebo Avocopan twice daily for 52 weeks together with oral prednisolone 60 milligram per day starting dose, which was tapered to 0 over 21 weeks, together again with the previous immunosuppressive treatments that the other group received, that is rituximab, cyclophosphamide, or azathioprine. So all the patients who entered the trial were properly accounted at its conclusion, because this was conducted in a modified intention to treat population, and therefore all the randomly assigned patients received at least 1 dose of the trial medication. The next question is, were the patients, health workers, and the study personnel were blind to the treatment? In order to protect the blinding, the randomization schedule was not accessible to anyone, like study personnel who had the contact with the study centers or who were involved in the data management or analysis prior to the database lock. And all the patients, trial personnel, and sponsor representatives involved in the conduct of the trial, they were unaware about the trial group assignments, and all the drugs that were provided were also given in identical bottles to not identify a difference. All the groups, the next one is whether the groups were similar at the start of the trial. So the demographic and clinical characteristics of the patients at baseline were similar in both treatment groups. This is a chart showing the demographic and clinical characteristics of the patients at baseline. So you can see both in the Avocopan group and the prednisolone group, almost all the characteristics are quite similar. Aside from the experimental intervention, whether the groups were treated equally is the next question. So all the patients who received the trial medication or prednisolone received the following 3 regimes, one of them for their other immunosuppressive management. They were either given IV cyclophosphamide at a dose of 15 milligrams per kilogram on the first day, and on weeks 2, 4, 7, 10th, and 13th. Part of the other group received oral cyclophosphamide at a dose of 2 milligrams per kilogram up till the 14th week. And another set of patients from each group received intravenous rituximab at a dose of 375 milligrams per square meter body surface area for first 4 weeks. And following 15 week onwards, those who received cyclophosphamide were given oral azathioprine at a dose of 2 milligrams per kilograms per day. But those who received rituximab did not receive further rituximab after the first 4 weeks. And investigators were instructed to minimize the additional glucocorticoid usage. And prophylactic therapy with infection for pneumocystis jirovecii was required to give according to the protocol. Apart from the trial medication prednisolone, the rescue therapy was available for patients who had either worsening of the disease or no improvement of the disease. If the patient had a worsening of the disease with a major item in the Birmingham Vasculitis Activity Score, they were treated with intravenous methylprednisolone up to 1 gram per day up to 3 days. If they have a non-major item worsening in the BIVA score, such patients were given short bursts of oral glucocorticoids at a dose of 20 milligrams per day. And if the patients did not have an improvement or stabilization of their major items in the score within the first 4 weeks of the trial medication or in the prednisolone group, they were given additional IV or oral glucocorticoids. So that answers the questions of the first stem of the analysis. So we can say that the trial has valid results. So the second stem of the analysis is what are the results. So I will go into the details of the results of the study. First part that we are going to analyze is that how large was the treatment effect, which is measured by what outcomes were measured and whether the primary outcomes were clearly specified and what results were found for each outcome. So the primary efficacy endpoints include achievement of remission at week 26 and achievement of sustained remission at week 52. And there were multiple secondary endpoints, which you can see. The secondary endpoints included the evaluation of change of health-related quality of life and biological response measures such as glucocorticoid toxicity measurement, EGFR measurement, urine albumin creatinine ratio, and urinary monocyte chemoattractant protein 1 to creatinine ratio, and change in vasculitis damage index, and also the incidence of withdrawals due to adverse events. So the first primary result was to evaluate at the 26th week achievement of remission. So about 72.3% of avacopan patients achieved remission at week 26, whereas only 70.1 patients in the prednisolone group received remission, achieved remission. So this was statistically non-inferior in the avacopan group compared to the prednisolone group, but superiority was not achieved. And at week 52, 65.7% of avacopan patients had a sustained remission, whereas only 54.9% of prednisolone patients had a sustained remission. So in a summary, avacopan was non-inferior but not superior to prednisolone taper with respect to the remission at week 26, but avacopan was superior to prednisolone taper with respect to sustained remission at week 52. So these are the other secondary efficacy endpoints. As you can see, in the avacopan group, the glucocorticoid toxicity is much less compared to the prednisolone group. And also the improvement of EGFR is higher in the avacopan group, which is shown in the maroon color. And the other change in health-related quality of life is also more in the avacopan group. So these are the primary and secondary key points summary. What we can gather from that is that there is a greater incidence of glucocorticoid-induced toxic effects in the prednisolone group. And avacopan is beneficial for the kidney function on the context of vasculitis. There was improvement of quality of life in both treatment groups, but there's a statistically significant improvement in the avacopan group. And the number of serious side adverse events, apart from worsening vasculitis, was 33% higher in the prednisolone group compared to the avacopan group. And there were more deaths, life-threatening and serious adverse events and infections in the prednisolone group compared to the avacopan group. So this is the summary, where there is a numerically superior, statistically significant non-inferiority at 26 weeks with a statistical superior sustained remission at 52 weeks. And all the other secondary parameters are statistically significant. In the safety analysis, there were 116 serious adverse events in the avacopan group and 166 in the prednisolone group. And the commonest serious adverse event was worsening of vasculitis. So this is the evaluation of the serious adverse events, which was higher in the prednisolone group. Right. So that answers the first part of the question, that how large was the treatment effect. Moving on to the second part, how precise was the estimate of the treatment effect? There are two questions to be answered. What are the confidence limits and were they statistically significant? So in the statistical analysis, planned sample size was 150 patients per group to provide the trial with at least 90% power to show non-inferiority of avacopan compared to prednisolone. So each of the group contained about 165 patients. Therefore, we can say it was adequately powered to show non-inferiority. And for the primary endpoints, at 26 weeks and 52 weeks, criteria for non-inferiority were met, but superiority was only met at week 52. And in the statistical analysis, the data that were missing at weeks 26 and 52 were imputed as not being in remission. For the secondary endpoints, point estimates and the 95% confidence intervals are presented, but no multiple comparison adjustments were made. Therefore, definitive conclusions were not drawn from them. So that answers this second question as well. Therefore, now the trial analysis shows that the results of the trial are valid, as well as the results are in keeping with the appraisal methods. The third question is whether the results help locally. The first problem is that can the results be applied to a local population in our context? So in the analysis, there were about 10% roughly Asian contribution, but the majority of contribution in the race was from white, which accounted for about 80%. So ANCA-associated vasculitis has a great heterogeneity in terms of clinical characteristics between ethnic groups. Therefore, the clinical response to treatment modalities should inevitably have the same difference. Therefore, more randomized control trials with a greater number of participants from Asia would be needed to clarify this doubt. Similarly, avacopan is still a novel agent that is not available currently in Sri Lanka. Therefore, we need to gather more experience on our context about the use of avacopan in Sri Lanka. So that remains a question for the local applicability. The second part is that whether all clinically important outcomes were considered. As stated in the protocol, all primary and secondary endpoints were analyzed and published, but there were a few concerns about the outcome which were not really considered very much. One thing is that the glucocorticoid usage in the avacopan group. Now, about 86% of patients in the avacopan group had also used glucocorticoid, although the daily dose was much less compared to the prednisolone group. It was about 1/3 of the prednisolone group. But this factor needs to be further evaluated to evaluate the assessment of glucocorticoid effect in the avacopan group, because they are not completely off steroids, rather they are on a low dose of steroids. And also at week 52, there was a difference between the rituximab group and the cyclophosphamide group with regard to the estimated risk difference for disease remission at week 52, which was 15% for the rituximab group and 3.3% for the cyclophosphamide group. Therefore, this needs also further evaluation with regard to the efficacy and safety of rituximab and cyclophosphamide with the use of avacopan. So up to some extent, the clinically important outcomes were considered and it needs further evaluation. The third question is, are the benefits worth the harms and cost? So the trial has shown significant efficacy of study drug with regard to ANCA-associated vasculitis treatment. And there's a significant hope on the probability of sparing glucocorticoids and its related side effects by the usage of avacopan. And there were no significant harmful effects noted in the limited 60-week analysis period of the study. But long-term effects of the drug need to be evaluated in the future. And that concludes the third question, whether the results help locally. So as you can see, the third part of the study needs further evaluation with regard to the local usage. So now that we have come to the end of the critical appraisal, we have answered all three questions about the critical appraisal of this journal article with the CASP tool. So the future scope would encompass that longer trials are required to determine the durability and safety of avacopan in the patients with ANCA-associated vasculitis. More importantly, in patients with Sri Lanka, for the local usage, we would need much more evidence-based data to use avacopan in our context. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Nimanthi, for excellent presentation. So are there any questions from the participants? Are there any questions? So Nimanthi, was it used for induction or the remission? I couldn't understand that.
Madam, it was used for both induction and remission. In certain amount of patients, they have received IV methylprednisolone up to 3 grams per day, up to 3 grams for the induction as well. But in other patients who are newly diagnosed or relapsed, they were given avacopan straight away without a prednisolone induction. So it was used as an induction agent as well. But the inclusion criteria considered some of the patients who had received prednisolone as well for the induction. So that was the bit of a problem, because part of the patients in the avacopan group had received prednisolone. That needs further analysis. But there was a group of patients who did not receive induction IV methylprednisolone, instead received avacopan alone. Therefore, this is used as an induction agent as well in the study.
Okay, thank you, Nimanthi. Thank you, Nimanthi, for excellent presentation. Now we will move to the next presentation. Next presentation will be by Dr. Palitha Disanayake, consultant in rheumatology and rehabilitation from Teaching Hospital, Karapitiya. And Dr. Palitha will be doing a case presentation on a patient SLE presenting with shortness of breath. Over to you, Palitha.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you very well.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Dr. Monica, for the introduction. So good afternoon. Welcome to the monthly clinical presentation in College of Rheumatology and Rehabilitation, Sri Lanka. Today I will be presenting the interesting patient, the SLE, presented with shortness of breath. So she's a 46-year-old patient, the diagnosed SLE with secondary antiphospholipid antibody syndrome about 20 years back, and presented to the clinic with a history of shortness of breath with minimal exertion over 1 week duration. She also having fatigue, loss of energy, and intermittent low-grade fever, and loss of appetite on direct questioning. But there was no history of chest pain, cough, or sore throat. There was no urinary symptoms, headache, abnormal behavior, fits, or abdominal pain. She also complained of vague body aches and pains, and importantly, no recent contact history of the COVID-19. Her past medical is interesting, goes up to 2002. So at the age of 28 years age, after 1 week after postpartum, she presented to the ward with a fever, fits, and jaundice. There she was investigated for the jaundice, and no much details available, and ultrasound shows some hepatitis. So she was partially investigated. After that, she was defaulted follow-up. In 2003, during second pregnancy, SLE was diagnosed, and at that time presented with fever, abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. And there she was investigated and found to have positive ANA and treated with steroids, and azathioprine was started. Up to 2016, uneventful, so managed with prednisolone 2.5 milligram and azathioprine 50 milligram, but which has very poor the defaulted clinic follow-ups and on and off attending to the clinics. In 2016, so presented to the medical ward with abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting, complicated with fits, and they are extensively investigated and found to have brain MRI have vasculitis, and they treated with pulse methylprednisolone and IV cyclophosphamide. And the started azathioprine and MMF. 2017, patient had first DVT in right lower limb, followed by recurrent DVT, and investigation revealed positive lupus anticoagulant and anticardiolipin antibodies. In 2017, patient psychotic episode with fits, and again treated with pulse methylprednisolone and started with MMF. And at that same time, they found to have severe anemia and jaundice with chorioretinitis. So extensively investigated for this presentation, and again underwent ANA, and this time dsDNA and home test, all are positive. This chorioretinitis, they thought of due to hydroxychloroquine, but other investigation shows positive toxoplasma IgG. But the eye surgeon says it's unlikely to be toxoplasma. And even that, the admission, she was treated with pulse methylprednisolone, followed by the tapering doses of oral prednisolone. In 2019, again found to have pancytopenia and with active lupus, and underwent bone marrow. It found that hypocellular bone marrow, and treated with pulse methylprednisolone, but at a poor response. And the extended course of pulse methylprednisolone up to 5 days, followed by oral prednisolone 1 milligram per kg, again poor response, and IG started, again poor response. Then ultimately discussed the hematology team, discussed rituximab 350 milligram per square meter weekly for 4 weeks. For this regime, patient cytopenia and clinically improved, and azathioprine and MMF restarted. Again, defaulted clinic follow-up. 2020, patient was admitted to the surgical unit with a fever, severe acute abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. And there are investigation for the, because acute, just like acute abdomen. An investigation revealed high ESR with CRP, severe pancytopenia, HB 6.5, WBC 1800 with platelet 8000. And ultrasound abdomen revealed acantholytic cholecystitis, but no pre-fluid, no bubble ischemia evidence, and mild hepatosplenomegaly. And because of the persistent the cytopenia, as second bone marrow again shows marrow aplasia, but no atypical cells. Again, patient treated with IV methylprednisolone plus high dose of oral steroids. The poor response, we have to start IV rituximab, same dose weekly for 4 weeks, and his gradually the blood counts and clinically improved with this regime. And then taking those steroids, azathioprine, patient was discharged with MMF and azathioprine. In the history, no family history of connective tissue disorders, and very poor drug compliance, and patient income is affected badly by the COVID-19. They were involved in tourism industry, so because of the COVID-19 and this very badly affected, and very poor family support. She's mother of 2 daughters. They are doing A-levels, and because of the financial crisis, husband is become alcohol abused. These are the drugs she was on, but only thing is poor compliance: oral prednisolone, azathioprine 50, MMF 1 gram BD, warfarin 8 milligram, calcium vitamin D, and the alendronate. On examination of this admission, average body build with and pale and mildly pteric, and no dyspnea at rest. She was, even though patient says febrile episode, a febrile after admission, no lymphadenopathy, and had a faint the petechial rashes over lower limbs, and in addition, no connective features suggestive SLE like oral ulcers, fatigue, the rashes, but patient had alopecia. Examination of the cardiovascular system revealed the tachycardia with low blood pressure. And respiratory and nervous system examination unremarkable, except the fundus and some the abnormal, actually seen by again abnormal that no cotton wool spots compatible with the vasculitis. And abdominal examination found hepatosplenomegaly, but no pre-fluid. When compared to 2019, the liver and spleen size is stable. And musculoskeletal examination is unremarkable. So these are the problems we faced. Subacute onset of shortness of breath with low-grade fever with tachycardia, with sort of pulmonary embolism, or the pneumonia because on immunosuppressive treatment, and the pleural effusion as a result of serositis. But this hepatosplenomegaly with jaundice and anemia with sort of hemolysis, but she had episode of autoimmune hemolytic anemia in past, and again viral hepatitis because of hepatosplenomegaly and jaundice. But it is this skin rash without vasculitic, but it's not a typical of vasculitic rash. We thought not due to vasculitis. So investigation revealed very high ESR. As usual, we did the PET and PCR for the COVID, both negative. CRP not very high compared to the ESR. Full blood count shows bicytopenia with HB 8.1 platelet 10,000. And the peripheral blood picture shows bicytopenia and no evidence of hemolysis, infection, or atypical cells. Urine UFR no active sediment. This is a chest X-ray. Initially, we thought some the inflammatory shadow in the left mid and lower zone, but reported by the consultant radiology say that is normal. ECG shows sinus tachycardia, and to the echocardiogram revealed pericardial effusion, no pericardial effusion with good ejection fraction, and liver profile no transaminitis, but bilirubin both direct and indirect slightly increased. The Mantoux test positive with the steroids, even with the hydrosteroids, and LDH level is elevated, significantly elevated, but no retic response. So the hemolysis is also less likely, but no retic, but LDH is elevated. Then third time underwent marrow aspiration and biopsy in this history. And this time marrow aspiration was dry tap. And the preferring biopsy shows cellular marrow, actually a little bit of hypercellular marrow, but no, with some abnormal cells, they can differentiate from the usual staining. Ultrasound abdomen and pelvis revealed hepatosplenomegaly, but the no lymphadenopathy or the free fluid. CCT chest and abdomen revealed again only the hepatosplenomegaly, no evidence of paraortic lymphadenopathy or free fluid. Then the repeat LDH further rose up to 9,600 for blood culture. So that is a alarming investigation. Further significant increase on this LDH, and blood cultures negative, and Coombs test this time, earlier Coombs positive, but this time again Coombs negative. So hemolysis also less likely. So what is the diagnosis? So is it SLE with hemolytic anemia, or we are dealing with the patient with some any other diseases like a lymphoma? But she had adequate evidence for the SLE. Both ANA, the dsDNA positive, APL is there, so serositis, history of CNS involvement, she had a past history of severe neuropsychiatric SLE. So background is adequate for the SLE, but this time we are dealing with the SLE or complicated with the, in some other manifestation. So how we manage the patient? So because of the tachycardia and the low, very low platelet count, we want to we give some vascular access, but difficult to gain a peripheral venous access. After the platelet transfusion, we managed with CEP line, and she was given IV methylprednisolone 1 gram daily for 5 days, followed by oral prednisolone 1 milligram per kg. So anemia and thrombocytopenia progressing even with the high dose of steroids, and need to give repeated blood and platelet transfusion to maintain blood and platelet count. And then because of poor response, IVIG again started, but again with IVIG, patient had very poor response. This is the investigation chart we kept in our unit for chronic patients. Here you can see. So start with the platelet count, actually 10,000 5 platelets. Then even with the high dose of steroid, platelet count became even 4,000. And the WBC count also causing pancytopenia, and on admission no leukopenia, but now even after steroids and IVIG, patient had developed pancytopenia with low HB, low platelet, and very low platelet and hemoglobin. So then we discussed with hematology team, and we thought of again this sort of maybe the hypercellular marrow, but very unlikely now hypercellular, not hypercellular this time, but because of severe the cytopenia progressing, we restart third cycle of rituximab for this patient. Rituximab 375 milligram per square meter weekly for 4 weeks with steroids. And patient the clinically improved, and the platelet count the just touch above 50,000, and warfarin restarted with subcutaneous heparin. This is the investigation summary and the trend of investigations after the rituximab, about third dose of rituximab. So the platelet count stable around 50,000, and the WBC just about normal range, just about 4,000, and no neutropenia or the lymphopenia. So while planning to discharge, we are waiting for the therapeutic INR. Then suddenly one MO phoned me. So the patient developed sudden onset fever with confusion at the age of 2 p.m. So she was took lunch without any problem. The 2 p.m. she suddenly developed the arthralgia, high fever, headache, and confusion. So the examination revealed no neck skin rashes, no neck stiffness, GCS 15. Even she's confused, but the tachycardia and hypotensive. So what would be the diagnosis? So now patient stable after the steroids and rituximab and about to discharge, and we are waiting for therapeutic INR, develop sudden onset this confusion and fever. We thought of ICH first because patient is still in the just 50,000 of platelets with vasculitis is going on. So we thought of ICH. The second one, whether it's sepsis, she was on long duration of high dose steroids. Third one, the meningoencephalitis, the infection in the central nervous system. Or fourth one, the microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, again, the non-complication of association of SLE. Then further investigation revealed there no evidence of microangiopathy in the blood picture, and CRP is 5. So very unlikely due to the infection, the sepsis, and NCCT brain shows no hemorrhages, and the MRI plate with the agent MRI as well, so no evidence of active vasculitis. Fortunately, patient's condition improved within 24 hours with only supportive care, with hydration and with some inotrope support. And patient was stable a couple of days after that, and the patient was discharged with prednisolone 1 milligram per kg. And then we got the immunohistochemistry report. They found that few scattered CD20 cells in the bone marrow. But according to them, this per se not enough for the diagnosis of lymphoma. So, but no other peripheral evidence, no lymphadenopathy suggestive lymphoma, except very high LDH. That also responded to the methylprednisolone and the rituximab. So we are awaiting further detailed report. So are we dealing with the hematological malignancy, or is purely the SLE with hematological hematology involvement? So we thought of whether this is a B-cell lymphoma. So what are the further investigation we can do? So underwent 3 times bone marrow, no lymphadenopathy. So for the tissue diagnosis, our next option is to get the liver biopsy. So if second, we up to now we don't have the proper immunohistochemistry report. So if it is no conclusion, we plan to do a liver biopsy to get the histological diagnosis. So the clinic, then the patient discharged with prednisolone 60 milligram per day, and the 1 week after the clinic review, the patient asymptomatic. The investigation revealed ESR 40, WBC is normal with no cytopenia, and patient feels no good appetite, and patient totally asymptomatic. Right. So now within next 20 minutes, I will just discuss what are the hematological manifestations of SLE. And you know, SLE is a prototype of autoimmune disease with variable multi-system involvement, and hematological abnormalities are common in each and most of the patients SLE. And it is maybe due to disease itself or due to adverse effect of the treatment or the maybe opportunistic infections. So what are the major hemolytic manifestations? Anemia, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia are common associations. But from TTP, thrombotic thrombocytopenia purpura, myelofibrosis, aplastic anemia, relatively rare association manifestation of SLE. And so patient may have lymphadenopathy and splenomegaly also. So hematological involvement is important even for the diagnosis. As you know, SLICC criteria, out of 11, 3 from hematology: hemolytic anemia, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia. In addition, SLICC in the EULAR criteria 2019, hematology criteria, leukopenia and thrombocytopenia and autoimmune hemolysis give very high marks. So the hematology is important for the even the diagnosis criteria. Anemia. So most common hematologic abnormality in the SLE patients, more than 50% with anemia, mostly chronic disease, maybe iron deficiency, and rarely autoimmune hemolytic anemia. In hemolytic anemia, it could be autoimmune or microangiopathic, or rarely due to infections and medication. And autoimmune hemolytic anemia is one of the more common etiology, giving severe anemia in short period. So our patient had one episode of admitted with another reason, and patient developed sudden onset anemia. So if a patient, stable patients suddenly develop anemia, we have to think of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And we have to first establish the diagnosis by haploidopathy bilirubin reticulocytosis, and secondly do the Coombs test, and thirdly we have to find the antibody, warm or cold. So the management of anemia, so autoimmune hemolytic anemia is a glucocorticoid first line treatment for hemolytic anemia, and majority of patients show the clear response to treatment, but about 10% of patients need second line therapy. So what are the indications for second line therapy? The patients no response in glucocorticoid in 3 weeks with 1 milligram per kg after pulse, or patient need more than 15 milligram per day for the maintenance dose. Then there's a definite indication. But second line therapy encourage, even if the count prednisolone 0.1 milligram per kg per day, this second line therapy is indicated, encourage. If a maintenance dose less than 0.1 milligram per kg, no need of second line therapy. So there are no general guidelines for what is the best second line agent. There are several agents we can try, IVIG, azathioprine, and recently rituximab has very good outcome, but the dose is different when the routine our fortnightly dose. We are giving rituximab 375 milligram per square meter weekly for 4 weeks. And aplastic anemia is a rare manifestation. Our patient had one episode of just like aplastic anemia at marrow hypoplasia, and sometimes only the patient has shortness of breath, but sometimes patient may have other features of thrombocytopenia like easy bruising, nosebleed, prolonged bleeding time. The etiology again due to disease itself. And remember the drugs, most of our patients are thiophrine, MMA, fluorocytotoxic drugs. These can cause aplastic marrow. In addition, viral infections, these patients a lot of immunosuppressive agents with lymphopenia and neutropenia, so risk of opportunistic infections. So these infections can cause aplastic anemia. So diagnosis, full blood count by pancytopenia and bone marrow shows the less than 20% of cellularity with fatty changes. No abnormal cells in the marrow. The treatment, we have to treat offending, omit offending drugs, and we have to give blood and platelet transfusion to maintain the functions, and immunosuppressants. Again, we have only few options in the history, no guidelines. What is the best one? So rituximab and cyclosporine tried in cases, and rituximab give a promising response. What are the other hematological abnormalities like a leukopenia? So leukopenia, as you know, defined as less than 4,000 in occasions, but mild neutropenia is a common finding in SLE. But severe neutropenia is less likely, usually found in less than 17% of patients in the studies. So mild neutropenia requires no therapy and usually improved with other treatments, but severe neutropenia with the history of infection is a place for colony stimulating factors. Then the lymphopenia is a commonly found in SLE, and so the marked lymphopenia is associated with active disease. So earlier when AN is not available, so patient with cytopenia with lymphopenia, we are suspect SLE. Both B and T lymphocyte may be affected, and there are no special recommendation on the treatment. But remember, these lymphocytes protect our body from the infections. So if a severe lymphopenia, sometimes need the prophylaxis for the pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Thrombocytopenia is a common clinical manifestation. So sometimes isolated low platelet count find in couple of months, even years before the SLE. And the thrombocytopenia in SLE patients, there are maybe two categories. One, the thrombocytopenia as a generalized disease. So the patient's stable platelet count. With the disease, patient will do very low platelet count, like in our patient. So in the normal, in the stable time, patient normal counts, but with severe disease, patient will severe thrombocytopenia, even with the prone to hemorrhages. And in the platelet count in these patients actually would very respond to the treatment with the glucocorticoids. But the other type, patient with chronic form, SLE patient has thrombocytopenia in the onset. So low grade, just platelet count less than 100,000 like, but no history of bleeding and the poor response to the steroids. And in addition, thrombocytopenia in SLE patient is a poor prognostic marker for severe thrombocytopenia. So low platelet count, the high risk of developing hemolytic anemia and neuropsychiatric disease and the renal disease. In addition, if you see severe thrombocytopenia, you have to exclude antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So the treating for the thrombocytopenia, because we have to treat, otherwise patient will very low count patient can develop hemorrhage, internal hemorrhages. For acute treatment, glucocorticoid is the cornerstone of the treatment. Then you can go danazol hydroxychloroquine added to the steroid for the sparing agent. Cyclophosphamide or low dose cyclosporine or vincristine can also be considered as a second line agent. But recent data found that rituximab is a very effective therapy in patients with refractory thrombocytopenia. Even our patient platelet count became 4,000 with the high dose of steroids, even IVIG, and improved with this rituximab, 4 cycles rituximab. The final option is splenectomy, but usually we didn't perform that because splenectomy in SLE, patient high risk of developing infections. Then, so malignancy. What are the malignancies in SLE? So, SLE is a significant increase in overall malignancy in individuals with systemic lupus erythematosus compared to health control. So there are the malignancy is a multifactorial. So nowadays, because of the patient lives long with our new treatment with biologicals, so the SLE patients can get malignancies as a normal people, because now, not like earlier days, the SLE patient now their mortality is less. So this patient can have normal malignancy, just like our normal population. And in addition, high risk of malignancy due to disease itself, or because of the drugs, or some opportunistic infections like Epstein-Barr virus. So this dysregulated immune signaling and environment insult leading to molecular changes which affect both inflammatory and neoplastic pathways. So same thing affects the inflammatory pathway as well as neoplastic pathway, and especially immunosuppressive action, cyclophosphamide per se can cause some, for example, bowel malignancy and cervical malignancy in females. And in addition, opportunistic infections can cause development of oncogenic viruses like Epstein-Barr virus. So it can again prone to high prevalence of the malignancies. Hematologic malignancies, including lymphoma, leukemia, and myeloma, recently shown to be increased in SLE patients. Recent data in the meta-analysis shows that these 3 hematological malignancies have been increased in patients SLE than the normal population. Out of these hematological malignancies, the most risk was associated with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Out of that, the large B-cell lymphoma is a highest possibility. And in addition, the incidence and mortality of all hematologic malignancies was significantly elevated in the SLE patient. So the SLE patient high risk of malignancy, and their mortality also increased because of the multiple reasons. In addition, increased risk of cervical dysplasia and high-grade squamous cell epithelial lesions in SLE patients, especially those who exposed to cyclophosphamide. In addition, risk of the pulmonary lung carcinomas, especially patients on smokers, and hepatic. Again, hepatic carcinomas multifactorial, maybe hepatitis causing cirrhosis and hepatocellular carcinoma, or with the treatment. And the thyroid cancers appear to be elevated in the SLE patients. So interestingly, hormone-driven carcinomas, just like prostate and breast cancers, risk is reduced. There's a good side at least. So it's possibility of screening the cancer in SLE patients. So now we discuss patient has this patient's high risk of malignancy due to the age, high risk of malignancy due to disease itself, high risk of malignancy due to the treatment. So is there any screening? So no guideline for the how to screen patient for the malignancy in SLE, but this should be tailored to patient's individual risk profile. And especially in SLE patient exposed to cyclophosphamide, they are the role for the more frequent pap smears or urine cytology screening for the bladder cancers. and chest X-ray and maybe the CT for the chain smokers with SLE. So that should the tailor-made decision. So at the end, so what could be our patient? So our patient, so we are partially treated lymphoma is still high possibility because we are giving 3 cycles of the rituximab and multiple pulses of high dose steroids, methylprednisolone, and high dose steroids since now couple of 2, 3, 4 years continuously. And patient overcount the treatment of steroids because of default follow-up. So are we partially treat the lymphoma? That's the main concern. And unfortunately, the thing is, her husband recently died from the fallen from height while she was in the ward. So now they have only 2 daughters. So we should have the proper diagnosis to save the life of this patient. So we are for our next option, we consider whole. We plan to get that proper immunohistochemistry report, and then if it is uncertain, plan to go for a liver biopsy. But if because this the hepatomegaly, splenomegaly is stable for a couple of years now, so that's the thing. That's the most negative thing. So 2019 that was there, even now it's the same size and not increased. So less likely, but this is the only hope, only the site we can get the tissue diagnosis for this the poor patient. Right, thank you for your kind listening. Any questions? I'm happy to answer.
So this patient most probably maybe having lymphoma, maybe with SLE, isn't it?
Yeah.
Patient responded to rituximab and steroids. That's the treatment for
lymphoma as well. That's the thing. Yeah, we are partially treating lymphoma since last couple of years. That's the main concern actually. But I think lymphoma regime is different. We are giving just like low doses, but the lymphoma regime we have to give high doses of rituximab and steroids. But anyway, she's nicely responded with low doses with steroids.
Other thing is sometimes this we have come across patients with immunoblastic lymphomas, T cell lymphomas having other autoantibodies and all this ANA positivity and lupus anticoagulant positivity with presentation of lymphoma but having autoantibodies and even and ANCA positivity.
But this patient, this patient had the DSDNA in PSLE, so enough evidence for the SLE. Yeah.
SLE with lymphoma. No?
Lymphoma, yes, SLE with
lymphoma. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Dissanayake, for this interesting presentation.
Okay, right. Thank you very much.
Now we will move to the next presentation, a case of necrotizing myositis by Dr. Metsala Gunawardena, consultant in rheumatology and rehabilitation, active consultant in rheumatology and rehabilitation, District General Hospital, Trincomalee. Over to you, Metsala.
Can you see my presentation?
Not yet. We can hear you, but still has the screen shows that you have started screen sharing, but still not appearing.
I'll share it again.
Okay. Still not appearing.
share.
හොඳට කරාද? ඇහුණාද? මේක බලන්න හොඳට කරන්න.
It says my screen sharing is paused. I'm not sure. It's not resuming as well. I'll try it again, madam.
Yes.
Dr. Metzler, that's probably because you have posted from your end, if you can.
I think from the PowerPoint, I may have posted.
No, it's there's a bar with controls.
Yeah.
Yes. All right.
Okay. Yes.
Can
now
you
we
see
can.
now? Okay, thank you, Chiranti. Right. This is a case of necrotizing myositis. First of all, thank you for letting me share this case with you for the College of Specialists in Rheumatology and Rehabilitation. And this case is of a 51-year-old Chinese lady with diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. Presented with generalized muscle pains and difficulty in getting up from seated position and climbing stairs, which was progressive for past 2 weeks before admission. She was recently treated for a urinary tract infection, which was culture positive with 2 antibiotics, nitrofurantoin and cefalexin. She improved her urinary symptoms. However, she was feeling tired and her muscles were becoming tender and weak day by day. However, she had no pain while walking. She was unable to climb the stairs or raise her arms above the shoulder level. There were no breathing or swallowing problems. There were no joint pains or swelling, no skin rashes, Raynaud's or any digital ulcers. She denied having any excessive hair loss, photosensitivity, or a recorded temperature, although she was feeling a bit feverish. She lost her appetite. And digging into the drug history, found out that she was being started on atorvastatin 40 milligram daily 6 months back. And she was on amlodipine and metformin for her comorbidities. She didn't have any significant rheumatological family history or any muscle or malignancy in the family. Her eldest brother had Guillain-Barré syndrome. She was taking an adequate amount of dairy products in her diet. She did not smoke, was not taking any alcohol. She lived with her husband and 3 children and worked in the same hospital as I was working in UK, where I met her. And examination revealed nothing much actually in the general examination. She was examined specifically to see if there's any features of like dermatomyositis, such as Gottron papules or heliotropic rash. There were no oral ulcers, digital ulcers, or any mechanics hands. There were no lymphadenopathy. She was not pale or ecteric. Musculoskeletal system examination revealed a bilateral asymmetrical proximal myopathy. And when I examined her in ward, although she was okay when she got admitted, with the walking, her neck flexors were weak, so she was getting progressive muscle weakness. She had a power of 3 in both upper limbs and right lower limb. In the left lower limb, power was around 2 proximally. The distal power was, however, normal. There were no sensory signs. There were no evidence of any active synovitis. Other system examination, however, didn't give me any clue at all. They were normal. So the differential diagnoses were, number one, she was referred querying inflammatory myositis, such as polymyositis, although she didn't have any rash. Dermatomyositis sometimes can present without rash. There have been cases. And inclusion body myositis, although it's unlikely with the age and the gender of the patient. Then the metabolic proximal myopathy was one of the differential diagnoses, vitamin D deficiency being very common in that country, osteomalacia and hypothyroidism. Being on statin, statin-induced myositis was one of the first differential diagnoses, and paraneoplastic syndrome, diabetic amyotrophy, having painful muscle weakness. And although at this age would be rare, some cases of muscular dystrophies can present like this. Investigations revealed ESR of 20 millimeters in first hour. CRP was 10. So there was a question about like the inflammatory markers were not very raised. So inflammatory myopathies felt to be unlikely at the first glance. Full blood count was essentially normal. Then the AST was 487, ALT was 604, creatinine phosphokinase was 16,249. So it was very high, although she didn't have any evidence of rhabdomyolysis with urine negative for hemoglobin. Calcium and vitamin D revealed normal. Thyroid TSH levels were normal. EMG showed widespread denervation changes with low amplitude spiky polyphasic motor units, an early recruitment pattern, suggestive of myopathy or myositis. So she underwent MRI of bilateral thighs, where she had the maximum weakness. Diffuse myositis was seen through the hamstrings, quadriceps adductor and gluteal muscles, and trace surrounding soft tissue edema was seen. So at this time, although the inflammatory markers were normal, the myositis was top on the list. ANA and rheumatoid factor was negative. She was tested for myositis specific antibodies, or the panel, which came back as negative. Meanwhile, statin was discontinued, but the muscle pain, weakness, and the creatinine phosphokinase levels did not improve. Then she underwent a muscle biopsy because she didn't improve, and the investigations didn't reveal very high inflammatory markers. It showed necrotic and regenerative fibers, suggesting a necrotizing myositis. So then, although the muscle-specific antibodies were tested, they don't test the anti-HMG-CR antibody in that. That is a special test which should be requested separately. So she was tested for that. That became highly positive with the 153 units in her, the normal range being 0 to 19. So again, paraneoplastic syndrome can be associated with this. So she underwent CT chest abdo-pelvis, which was normal. So the diagnosis is statin-induced anti-HMG-CR antibody, positive, necrotizing myopathy. So what was the management? Number one, as we already did, withholding statins or stopping statin. And she was started on oral prednisolone 1 milligram per kg with omeprazole, proton pump inhibitor, calcium and vitamin D supplements for bone protection. So she improved 70% of her symptoms, especially weakness, with like 48 hours of starting steroids. So methotrexate was started as a steroid sparing agent with folic acid. And she remained better with improved creatinine phosphokinase levels during the follow-up visit. But she was, mind you, was having on a very high dose of oral prednisolone, being a diabetic patient, and she was having various side effects of prednisolone with very high blood sugar levels. So being that in mind, so what is statin-induced necrotizing autoimmune myopathy? Short form is SINM. It is a type of immune-mediated necrotizing myopathy. It is a disabling type of autoimmune myopathy characterized by severe muscle weakness, markedly elevated CK, and muscle necrosis. There are 3 types of immune-mediated necrotizing myopathy, not only this HMG-CR antibody positive one. There are 3 types. One is anti-SRP, signal recognition protein myopathy. The next one is this statin-induced or anti-HMG-CR myopathy. And the third one is antibody negative immune-mediated necrotizing myopathy. So basically, we should have the antibody levels checked to distinguish between these 3 types. So the incidence of HMG-CR antibody positive myositis is very rare. Incidence of myositis, the whole inflammatory myositis, is again 11 per 1 million person years. So this one is even rarer. 6% of all patients with suspected immune-mediated myopathy who underwent muscle biopsy were found to have these positive antibodies against HMG-CR. From this set of patients, up to 80% only had been exposed to statins. So there's a proportion of patients who have never been exposed to statins as well. When we take patients who are taking statin, this occurs in 1 of 100,000 patients. And one study found that Asian population without statin exposure may have higher incidence of this anti-HMG-CR myopathy. So the causes for which I'll come into that later in my slides. So what's the difference between self-limited statin myopathy and statin-associated immune-mediated necrotizing myopathy? So number 1, self-limited statin myopathy is very common, seen in 7 to 29% of statin users, and it's very common. Everybody of us have seen that. And myalgias are very common, although proximal muscle weakness is uncommon. The most important differentiation is not the CK level. Maybe the CK level may very high in statin-induced necrotizing myositis, but the clinically, if there's no improvement after withdrawing statins, so that's when we suspect statin-induced necrotizing myositis. And the muscle biopsy MRI may show supportive features, especially the biopsy showing necrosis in the statin-induced necrotizing myositis one. And it needs immunosuppression. So this should be diagnosed without much delay to prevent permanent muscle damage, because after the muscle necrosis, they are replaced with fat and not the muscle. When discontinuation of statin does not improve muscle weakness or the CK level, we should immediately suspect this condition. So what were the causes of Asian people without statins having this condition? And they found that there was some dietary products containing statin-like substance. One of such thing is this oyster mushroom, which is a common Asian, common in Asian cuisine, and Fiore tea. Sorry, I can't pronounce it very well. It is a Chinese herbal tea that also contain statin. So not all the patients with this condition were exposed to the medication statin. Some were naive to statin. What is the role of anti-HMG-CR antibody? It is a diagnostic marker of this condition, which has a sensitivity of 94.4% and a specificity, very high specificity of 99.3%. It is also a marker of disease activity, but practically it's not used as a, practically it's not repeated because of the cost, and it rarely normalizes after clinical improvement. So it's more or less a diagnostic marker, but very high titers, we can get impression about the prognosis and the severity of the disease. So statins, they cause direct muscle toxicity, causing regeneration of the muscles to overexpress the HMG-CR, the receptor. And again, it modifies the receptor so that there's a positive feedback loop caused by autoimmune response, leading to more and more antibody formation, targeting these overexpressed receptors. So this is like a vicious cycle going on and on, leading to necrotizing myopathy. It's a positive feedback loop. So the duration of statin treatment, although in our patient it was very short duration, patients who've been on statin for a longer time without any symptoms, without anything such as myalgia, so any symptoms, can develop this devastating disease. So in one study, median duration of statin therapy before the onset of muscle symptoms was 38 months. The long-term exposure to statins was found to be required in one study to have this to develop this autoimmune myositis, and 85% of patients had more than 6 months of exposure to statins. So it's not necessarily the patients might not remember that they are on this drug because they never had any symptoms earlier. So it's very important to dig into the history and get it out. And the different statins, the atorvastatin is the well-known culprit, and simvastatin and rosuvastatins were found to have less association with this condition. So, and our patient had diabetes, which is also shown to be a risk factor for this particular condition. So she was on atorvastatin and she is a diabetic patient. Both of these were very well associated with this condition and has been repeatedly shown in case reports, although there are no randomized control trials as such. Prognosis wise, younger the patient, the prognosis is poor, and younger patients, anyway, statin exposure has not been shown. And association with malignancy is definitely increased than the normal population, but less so commonly than seronegative immune-mediated necrotizing myositis. Usually this malignancy risk is higher with age more than 50 years and within 3 years of diagnosis of this particular condition. And adenocarcinoma of the GI tract, breast, uterus, ovaries are the most reported malignancies, although few cases of lymphoma, melanoma, and thyroid cancer are also reported. Treatment, number one and most important thing is immediate stopping of statin. and to never ever re-challenge. And steroids, number one, most of the time needing steroid sparing agents because of the adverse side effects of the steroids and the prolonged disease course, prolonged and chronic disease course. Usual steroid sparing agents are methotrexate or azathioprine, and IV immunoglobulin has been shown to be very effective in this condition, although our patient didn't receive it in the first instance. The refractory cases, IV immunoglobulin can be given more frequently. Even one study, they have given 1 weekly doses. And we can combine azathioprine and methotrexate together. Rituximab also has been shown as the 4th line agent, can be effective, although there are no trials today. So these are my references. And thank you very much for your kind listening.
Oh, interesting. So has anybody come across satin-induced necrotizing myositis in our patients? So I don't know whether it's rare. No, we don't do it. You know, we don't. It's available.
Can we do the
I
test
think
here?
I have discussed with one of my neurology colleagues actually, and although I'm not sure whether it's done in Sri Lanka, but some of the private labs might do it. I'm not very sure about that. I thought of checking on that, however.
Yeah, that's the problem. Without that, you can't make a diagnosis, isn't it?
Yes, but clinically, sir, I mean, sometimes we might get a clue if by the clinical cause of the disease.
Yeah, probably biopsy, no? If you
Yeah,
have
and the
biopsy, will be
biopsy.
different to our normal myositis. So that's the only thing that we can go by.
Yeah.
Is it possible to differentiate from inflammatory myositis with the biopsy?
Yes, madam.
Yes,
inflammatory
yes,
myositis, in lymphocyte infiltration, these things are more common. Whereas here, it's more necrosis and fatty infiltration like things. Although our patient, there were some inflammatory changes, but the classical dermatomyositis and polymyositis changes are not there in this case. And we can differentiate that.
Yeah, Metsala, you talked about the steroid sparing agent. You mentioned methotrexate and azathioprine.
Yes.
Is there any preference that you should be given when you are selecting a steroid sparing agent, either methotrexate or azathioprine?
As I mentioned, there had not been any like trials or anything done in this regard, because one thing, it's very rare. So only going with the case reports and case series, methotrexate has been their #1 choice. And our patient also, we have referred to one expert in neuromuscular disease in UK. So his choice was also methotrexate. And combined therapy with methotrexate and azathioprine was also in
Mitsala.
Okay.
Mitsala, we can't hear you. Okay, are there any more questions? So shall we conclude now? Thank you very much, Mitsala, for very interesting presentation. And I thank all of you for the participation. And on behalf of College of Specialty in Rheumatology and Rehabilitation in Sri Lanka, so we'll meet in August with next meeting. Thank you very much.